Hello. The following is from my treatise titled On State Power and the Administration of Nations. This is Section 1, the Philosophical. Let us begin. The nature of state power, beyond the mundane, is such that it possesses two primary uses: to see justice done and to commit crimes. What constitutes each one of these will no doubt vary among people and groups. This is irrelevant for now. The basic ideas will do. Within any given state of sufficient size, there will certainly exist those willing to leverage state power to commit crimes for their own benefit. As this is detrimental to the state, it must be contained. This may prove difficult if the head of state is prone to criminal activity. Even so, criminals must at the very least pretend to contain the problem. Every state that has ever existed has had to contend with this to some degree. How to prevent the criminally disposed from obtaining state power is a subject of much debate. There are two old schools of thought on the matter, easily divided. These are volunteer government and mandatory government. Machiavelli writes, "All states and governments that ever ruled over men have been either republics or monarchies." I agree with this statement and believe that these two forms of government are largely representative of the two schools of thought that I have mentioned. I believe that a monarchy is generally representative of mandatory government and that a republic is generally representative of volunteer government. It may well be so that monarchies have been ruled by volunteers, and that republics have been ruled by those nominated or mandated. Cincinnatus springs to mind on this second account. Despite this, I hold that the form of government utilized is often indicative of the school being pursued. Let us now examine the underlying ideas supporting each of these schools. I will begin with volunteer government. The first idea of volunteer government is that by drawing from the general populace, the best and brightest can be found to administrate nation-states. It is expected that some number of the competent citizens will proffer their services to the state. They are then to be confirmed, generally by an electorate previously given franchise. Additionally, it is posited that because these administrators are drawn from the general populace, they will be fair when dealing with their constituents. Beyond these basic principles, the notion of volunteer government is presumed further buttressed by the belief that the participation of the electorate will increase trust and confidence in the government. Volunteer governments that operate as representative governments also employ a number of institutions meant to reinforce their structure. The first of these is a constitution. This is a document which records the fundamental laws and principles of a government. The functions and limits of a government are presumed to be contained within it. This is a document that, once ratified, is usually difficult to amend. This is also a document that is often considered the chief legal authority in the nation in which it is instituted. Another of these institutions is the division of state power. The objective of this institution is to balance power among groups within a government and thereby attempt to prevent any abuse of power by any one of these groups. These divisions are often ordered by function. There are various ways to make these divisions. One of the most common is to place legislators in one group, those who conduct the more direct affairs of government in a second group, and then these are accompanied by what is presumed to be an independent judiciary. The ultimate idea of a representative government is that the true power of the state rests with the people. This has been but a brief summary of two concepts, representative government and volunteer government. One is a form of government, the other is a school of thought on forming governments. Though the group of ideas presented was small, It is only these ideas that I wish to address at the moment. I will now give you my view on each of these ideas. With regard to the utility of these ideas, either as a justification for a given government or as a prescription for institutions to be used in the formation of a given government, my opinion is as follows. I reject each and every one of them outright. I will now state my reasons for such a rejection. However, I will only give philosophical reasonings in this section. Reasons based upon empirical facts will be given in the next section. I stated at the beginning that the nature of state power was such that it possesses two primary uses: to see justice done and to commit crimes. The nature of state power is also such that its possession is far more attractive to the criminally disposed. What joy or benefit does one who would see justice done gain from state power? If a man is murdered in cold blood, and state power is exercised to see justice done, what do those agents of the state responsible for this conclusion receive? Precious little, I think. If the effort to see justice done is particularly great, they might well receive praise, awards, or financial bonuses. Otherwise, they will simply be described as doing their jobs. What joy or benefit does one who is criminally inclined gain from state power? A great many, I think. The permutations are nearly endless. If one has spent any decent amount of time in any one of the nation-states of the earth, then one has no doubt seen an example of what criminals can do to benefit themselves while wielding state power. It is often stated that power corrupts, and that absolute power corrupts in an absolute fashion. Nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, power has no magical capacity to corrupt. It is simply that the corrupt are far more likely to seek it stridently. It is primarily for this reason that those who utilize volunteer government will be doomed to failure and interminable corruption. I will now directly address the ideas put forward earlier in support of volunteer and representative governments. I intend to tear them down. The first idea put forward was that by drawing from the general populace, the best and brightest could be found to administrate nation-states. The thought process is simple. Cast the widest net, find the most treasure. However, this is not the case. Not when there are those who would throw themselves into the net and thus fill it up. Others might avoid the net altogether. Criminals will forever attempt to insinuate themselves into power structures. Once they have a foothold within a system of volunteer government, they are particularly difficult and unpleasant to remove. It is for these reasons that such an idea fails. It is for these same reasons that the second idea put forward will fail. The idea that because administrators are drawn from the general populace, they will be fair when dealing with their constituents. It is believed that the lack of a class divide, among other factors, will result in fewer instances of corrupt activity. This is patently false. The third idea put forward was that the participation of the electorate would increase trust and confidence in the government. The level of trust and confidence in government, however, is often determined by the performance of that government, with whatever propaganda that any given group believes, added or subtracted. As such, this idea is also nonsense. If anything, such tends to heighten the susceptibility of the electorate to feelings of betrayal. Beyond these ideas, I also mention certain institutions that are often employed with the aim of strengthening representative governments. The first of these referred to was that of a constitution. Such a thing is often held to be the highest law of a nation. In fact, it is sometimes revered by certain segments of its nation. Despite this, a constitution is only as good as the government that upholds it. For this reason, the function of a constitution is often relegated to that of a dead or invalid king, a king that cannot defend itself, a king that cannot speak for itself, a king that cannot prevent its own circumvention. It is for this reason that constitutionally organized governments very often find themselves in a state of de facto interregnum. What good is an invalid king when he is so easily ignored? The division of state power is an example of another institution regularly deployed by representative governments. This institution presumes to prevent the coalescing of state power in any given segment of a government. The intent is to deny certain powers to any of the criminally inclined who may have compromised a segment of a government. This idea neglects the fact that many criminals are willing to utilize infiltration tactics to insinuate themselves into positions of power. As such, criminals are easily capable of infiltrating any given segment of a government, no matter how well divided it is from the others. The result of this is that those who have not entered government under false pretenses find their jobs much harder. Separation of powers works very well against those not willing to violate its principles. Not so well against the opposite, and once criminals have embedded themselves within a state's government, they are terribly difficult to excise. The final idea that I presented, one that I characterized as the ultimate idea of representative government, is the idea that in such a government, the true power of the state rests with the people. You might well believe that in practice this is completely true. You might believe that this premise is entirely false, and that the people hold no power at all. You might believe that the truth lies somewhere between the two. You might believe that one state exemplifies such a notion, and that another does not. Every one of these things is irrelevant. It does not matter which of these things is true. This idea is a farce any which way. If you are of the opinion that the people of the general public holding the power of the state is a lie, then you no doubt already agree that such an idea is a farce. The alternative is much worse. If the people are the power of the state in representative governments, then this constitutes the greatest travesty of justice in human history. If they have the power, then they must have the responsibility as well. That is what it means to have the power, that you have the responsibility. If the people have the power, then the representatives of a government are their proxies, explicitly wielding power on their behalf. If this is the case, then any time a government prosecutes a clandestine war, commits acts of genocide or mass murder, funds or initiates acts of terrorism, or engages in any other heinous crime, then the electorate that empowered this government is itself responsible. This is true for the entirety of the electorate. The voting arrangements of representative governments are almost always structured in such a way that those whose preferred representative does not win election agrees to accept the winner as their proxy, so long as the voting process itself is fair. This is the reason that the whole of the electorate is responsible for the government that they presume to empower. What is the proper penalty for orchestrating or attempting to orchestrate a campaign of genocide, for committing mass murder, for engaging in acts of extreme terrorism. I will tell you, it is death. This is where the great travesty of justice comes in. If a nation with an electorate of tens of millions should engage in the aforementioned activities, how would justice ever be done? The trials would last for decades. Even if such a thing could be accomplished, it would result in the eradication of the nation in question. The result of this is that untold millions, who by all rights should face the penalty of death, walk free. The people are eager to claim the power, and yet are always last in line to claim the responsibility. This concludes my initial review of the ideas and institutions common to volunteer government and the representative governments that often use volunteer government. I will now examine the ideas of mandatory government and the monarchies that often use these ideas. I will endeavor to keep this part brief, as I intend to mount my primary defense of mandatory government in the empirical section. Mandatory government is a very old concept. It was the first method used by human beings to select a leader. When mankind was still primitive, the most powerful in a group would seize what was a readily apparent mandate and rule their clan or tribe. Over time, these groups grew into kingdoms where one leader would pass his mandate to the next, either their own child or an adopted heir. While I am aware that there are many different kinds of succession, I will not be including all of them here. Additionally, I am aware that not every form of mandatory government has only one leader, the Imperial Roman Tetrarchy being one example. This is rare though, and so I will not be including such things either. I intend to focus on autocratic, hereditary monarchy. The primary idea of mandatory government is to prevent state power from being seized by the corrupt or the incompetent. By designating an individual who will receive the mandate to rule, systems of mandatory government attempt to circumvent any of the corrupt who would use state power for their own ends. While this strategy is not perfect, it has been used to great effect in the past. Some might tell you that this is not the case. I can assure you that they are mistaken. The unfortunate reality of government is that if you do your job quite well, then it will often be the case that no one will be sure that you did anything at all. Nearly every monarchy that has ever existed has attempted to maintain a princely or noble class. The reason for this is simple. The administration of nations is not a game, not something for children to participate in at their leisure and for their pleasure. To properly wield state power requires not only great intelligence, but more importantly, the appropriate education. A thorough education on the subjects of history, diplomacy, geography, economics, law, and military strategy is required. This is particularly true for a head of state. This is why a noble military class is maintained, so that able administrators are always available. Representative governments often have specialists in each of these fields. This leaves them with a dearth of people who can see the entire picture when dealing with larger events. Beyond this, a princely class often serves to set an example for small, local government administrators. As representative governments are prone to endemic corruption, the top administrators of these governments often serve as an example of good conduct to no one. The nobility is the only class that consistently studies the subjects I have mentioned as a whole body of necessary knowledge. This gives them a distinct advantage. The final idea of mandatory government that I wish to address, and by far the most important, is that of autocracy. This is the method by which things are achieved. For better or worse, this is what is effective. Autocracy is the measure by which a monarch sees justice done or sees evil done. Representative governments generally try very hard to avoid using the principles of autocracy. This is the reason why representative governments are usually not particularly useful. Representative governments tend to either maintain the status quo or degenerate further into corruption. Be certain, however, that if a nation with a representative government should be threatened with annihilation, the speed with which they revert to autocracy will be truly astounding. Autocracy is therefore the only method by which justice can be achieved on a substantial scale. This concludes my initial review of the ideas of mandatory government and those monarchies that utilize them. I will now compare and contrast additional elements of these philosophies more directly. First, I intend to examine the effects of the inevitable corruption of representative governments on their nations over time. As time passes within nations that use volunteer government as their method for selecting leaders, it is inevitable that some among the corrupt will insinuate themselves into that country's power structure. This is, of course, assuming that the principle of volunteer government was not instituted by criminals in the first place, as is very often the case. The corrupt are always the most voluble in agitating for the institution of systems of volunteer government. Once such a system becomes corrupt enough, those who are not corrupt will refuse to volunteer. They will refuse to become entangled in such a system. Allow me to give you a small theoretical example. Let us say that within a nation it is determined that each district will have an elected chief doctor, for the purpose of ensuring that all medical practices within a district are in compliance with that nation's laws. Initially, this may prove useful. If those who have an understanding of the various medical fields are empowered, then they might well prove able administrators. Eventually, though, the corrupt will find a reason to attempt to obtain these positions for themselves. This will beget a constant stream of criminals who will angle for these positions. Once enough of them have been successful, the politics surrounding these elections will become increasingly polarized and confused. Eventually, most of those who possess any kind of medical background will refrain from participation altogether. This will ultimately result in the degeneration of the process into a complete farce. Who will prevent such a thing? Is it the electorate? Unlikely. If the general populace were well educated enough to discern one who knows much about medicine from a criminal, then they probably wouldn't need doctors at all. If everyone's mother is a neurosurgeon, everyone's brother a cardiologist, and everyone's cousin a urologist, and so on, then the whole matter would be irrelevant anyway. In much the same way, if every member of the human species were a prince or a statesman, then large-scale governments would not be necessary. The general populace are no more qualified to determine who should be a neurologist than they are to determine who should be a head of state. Just as a neurologist requires a thorough education of the various components of the human nervous system and those things which could affect it, so does a head of state require a thorough education on the governments that have been instituted by mankind, the conflicts that they have been part of, the problems that they have faced, and the attempted solutions that they have employed. In short, the electorate of a given nation generally does not understand the political realities of the peoples and the nations through the ages. So it is that when the corrupt come to power in a representative government and leverage that power to commit crimes while operating under color of law, it is the electorate that is, at best, an accessory to these crimes, and at worst, the perpetrators of the crimes of the government that they presumed to empower. This leads me into another point. Once the representative government of a nation has been compromised by the corrupt, it is often stipulated by members of the electorate that the solution is to vote all current representatives out and to vote in a new group of representatives. It is believed that fresh blood will assist them in rectifying the problems of their government. It is believed that if the fat cats who work with corrupt entities outside the government were to be replaced, then some of their issues would be assuaged. This is a very bad idea. To replace those who are wealthy and corrupt with those who are poor and corrupt will not end well. If anything, this will constitute a boon for anyone who wishes to purchase favors from the government. Those who are poor and corrupt will be willing to accept a lower price for each service rendered. This means that such a strategy will only serve to increase the influence of corrupt organizations over a nation's government. You might well ask, if what I have said is true, if mandatory government is so thoroughly superior to volunteer government, then why is it that so many of the world's nations have instituted republics? How did criminals gain so much power? I will tell you presently. The introduction of mechanical movable type printing by Johannes Gutenberg and associates in the mid-15th century AD led to a revolution in the dissemination of information. It also eventually led to a revolution in the dissemination of propaganda. For hundreds of years now, all manner of leaflets, pamphlets, and books containing the most spurious of deceptions have spread throughout the world like a wildfire. This veritable onslaught of propaganda has had one chief aim: to tear down the noble class and its monarchies by any means necessary. This is achieved by denigrating and slandering these houses with a tsunami of lies so vast that only the wisest could come out the other side. Once this is done, the corrupt and those with an ambition tantamount only to folly attempt to institute a representative government. If this should occur, then the criminals of a nation will know that the ball is in their court, so to speak. I will now describe to you the methods used to construct such a propaganda machine. I will also describe the methods used to maintain it. The first step in the creation of a propaganda machine is the introduction of the concept of free speech. It sounds quite pleasant, but I can assure you that it is not. The purpose of this concept is simple, albeit indirect. The object is to create a cacophony of palavering nonsense. This turns the body of public knowledge into an enigmatical conundrum which serves as a basic fabric through which more direct strands of propaganda are run. The spoken word is the most powerful weapon of mass destruction in all the history of the world, and though most lack the intellect to utilize it to its fullest potential, the incessant caterwauling of so many metaphorical small arms of the verbal variety is more than enough to create havoc aplenty. In addition to this, the written word is nearly as powerful. Once a significant enough level of mass confusion has been achieved, specialized organizations are formed that are then presented as authoritative sources of information. These organizations are responsible for delivering the more direct forms of propaganda. The information that they disseminate runs the gamut from little white lies all the way up to outright falsehoods. From organizations that circulate leaflets in individual towns and cities, these groups grew to encompass many major publishing houses and newspapers. As technology has progressed, the list of these organizations has expanded to include modern delivery methods such as television and film. The chief purpose of such propaganda is simple: to slander and discredit the concepts of monarchy and mandatory government without end. The reason for this is also simple. The corrupt know that there is only one thing that could ever truly stop them. Well, some of them know. The rest are useful idiots. To achieve the discrediting of their opposition, no tactic is considered unacceptable to the partisans of volunteer government. From the most despicable lies to the most heinous massacres, nothing is considered too grotesque. The belligerents, whose aim is to establish representative governments, are willing to induce famines, murder in coldest blood, and engineer economic crises. Once such an act has been perpetrated, they are swift to lay the blame at the feet of their opponents, using their propaganda apparatus to great effect. They are quick to proclaim the failure of absolute monarchy, and yet their reasons for doing so are either couched in lies or mysteriously missing altogether. The advance of technology over the last few centuries has aided the development of this propaganda machine, but it is not the primary reason for its success. In fact, this machine gains most from the simple passage of time. After the first pair of generations are indoctrinated by the partisans of representative government, this propaganda machine becomes a thing which perpetuates itself. The ramifications of this can be clearly seen in the modern age. Few are the depictions of monarchy that do not paint it as the domain of animals, fantasy, the incompetent, or the evil. I very much doubt that every one of the people responsible for such representations are corrupt, and yet this is the power of propaganda. They are made to serve all the same. Freedom of speech is a concept which presumes to put the words of the corrupt and foolish on a level with the words of the wise and those who seek justice. The corrupt will bide their time until they believe their strength sufficient, and then they will move to silence outright their opposition. This is inevitable. Hypocrisy rarely means anything to such groups. These are the reasons that make freedom of speech beyond dangerous. Thankfully, feeling assured of complete victory, the partisans of representative government have relaxed their grip, and whispers of monarchy have begun. Mass discontent with the republics of the world have opened the door. Another cog in the machine of propaganda is the claim that all are born equal, and as such all possess equal potential. This is another lie that sounds good on its face. Reality readily disproves this thought, though. That there was ever even one born without a hand or without the use of their sight is evidence enough that this constitutes a complete falsehood. Those who fail to meet the unreasonable expectations that might be derived from such a belief fall into a perpetual, answerless introspection. In this way, a thing that is usually quite valuable, introspection, is turned into a shield for the corrupt. If many are busy examining themselves in detail, then it is unlikely that they will have much time to examine their government. If this introspection is answerless and without end, all the better. The reality of this situation is that some are born with the potential to be great, and many are not. Such ideas also have the potential to foment resentment in every single segment of the population. The great are told that their accomplishments are exclusively the result of resources, good fortune, or hard work. While this may be completely or partially true, or some combination thereof, in the event that it is not, anger is usually quick to follow. Conversely, those who are not seen as great are told that this is because others will not invest in them, that they are too lazy, or that others simply refuse or are unable to acknowledge their greatness. While these things also may be completely or partially true, or some combination thereof, in the event that they are not, anger is generally quick to follow here as well. It is for these reasons that the notion that all are born equal is dangerous indeed. The last component of the propaganda machine that I wish to discuss is that of mass education or mass schooling. This includes both public and private institutions that presume to teach those ranging from young children all the way up to adults. Such institutions rarely rely on the direct conveyance of propaganda. Instead, these institutions combine useful instruction in subjects such as language, science, and mathematics, with a complete refusal to acknowledge historical realities, or a complete inversion of those realities. This includes the omission of key facts, or even entire historical periods that are deemed inconvenient by those who support volunteer government. They also prefer to discuss those time periods where their worldview was in the ascendant. As such, they tend to avoid any pre-Cromwell era. When such a time period is discussed, it is only ever with the most dismissive and banal generalities. The topic of those who support mandatory government is, generally speaking, actively avoided. In the event that the subject of those who advocate for mandatory government is broached, a spate of hand-waving and colorful denigration often ensues. To hear the partisans of representative government tell their version of history is to hear a tale of them wrestling with invisible entities and outright caricatures. The reason for all of this is straightforward: to deny important context and understanding about the historical and political realities of the world. On top of this, students at these institutions are often directly informed or otherwise made to believe that their understanding of the world is far more comprehensive and accurate than any previous generation. While this may be true on account of the sheer volume of resources available for investigation, it is generally unlikely. The end result of all this deception is a large group of people in possession of a combination of ignorance and arrogance so powerful that it is nigh unbreakable. Ignorance alone can be corrected, but to lay arrogance over top of this is to create a truly captive servant. This concludes my examination of the propaganda machine employed by those who favor representative government. You may well ask, how can a government function without some number of volunteers? Surely at least some of the lower-ranked magistrates and other government officials must be drawn from volunteers. If what has previously been described is true, then how can corruption be stopped among these ranks? A fair series of questions, to be sure. I will answer them directly. The solution is a policy of no tolerance for those who commit serious crimes while acting under color of law. Those who perpetrate serious offenses under color of law must face the penalty of death. May no pardon issue, save for in the most extraordinary of circumstances. Some might say that this is too much, that such a policy is likely to result in a bloodbath. I disagree on both counts. First, I will say that the iron fist is good when it falls on the side of justice, when the scale is tipped irrevocably in favor of justice. Second, human beings are not as stupid as they are often made out to be, and as such, when a certain example is made, many will find it easy to comply. So it is that such criminals must be made into an example, in public. This leads me directly to another point: the unwillingness of representative governments to exercise in public some of the powers that they claim to possess. The reason for this is clear. Some number of a representative government's administrators are sure to know, in the very bottom of their hearts, that their justification for wielding state power is built upon a foundation of lies. As such, they will not dare to exercise the highest powers of a state without waiting for or manufacturing a crisis to serve as an external justification. Otherwise, they would swiftly reveal themselves. For all of their bluster about the supposed superiority of volunteer government, in little ways they reveal themselves. The first of these is obvious. The administrators of representative governments accord mandates to themselves. Ostensibly, these are derived from the electorate. Oddly enough, these supposed mandates are readily ignored, often with nothing in the way of consequences. That is because these mandates are fake, the product of imagination. They are claimed so as to give the illusion of mandatory government. Another of these things is for some to proclaim large nation-states with representative governments empires. This is, at best, a foolish colloquialism, at worst, an outright misrepresentation. At worst, this constitutes a thinly veiled attempt to claim imperial dignity, imperial authority, and an imperial mandate therein. These 2 points, along with others I have previously mentioned, create a truly garish horror of a situation, one where none may rule openly. Anyone who would publicly claim the ultimate authority of a state is laughed off as a foolish child or a psychotic madman. This will inevitably lead to the formation of a shadow government that will exercise the powers of a state's ultimate authority in secret. The partisans of volunteer government fancy the power, but do not dare to claim it openly. Thomas Carlyle once wrote of great men destined to rule by virtue of the innate qualities that they possess, men whose greatness deserves the utmost respect that mankind can give to one another. I concur with this sentiment most heartily. However, a word of caution, for if one seeks such a man, they may well find him, or they may find Erudian Romanovich Raskolnikov, the fictitious protagonist of Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment. So be careful to whom you accord the sobriquet of great. There are some who only view the politics of the world through the lens of class conflict, so for those people I will make things simple. The proletariat will never rule. The very notion is laughable. Such a thing would be tantamount to anarchy. So it is that the true choice is between the bourgeoisie and their republics, or the nobility and their monarchies. The bourgeoisie and the nobility are natural occurrences. Even were they to be wiped out down to the last man, woman, and child, they would rise again from out of the human species itself. There is absolutely nothing that you can do about this. If anything, the greatest failure of the world's monarchies is permitting the bourgeoisie to employ their system of usury. This allowed the partisans of representative government to finance their terrorist organizations, their propaganda machine, and various revolutions of their orchestration. Beyond this, usury is itself dangerous. I am no master economist, and so I will not pretend to be Thomas Sowell. However, I will tell you this: the system of usury is one that creates wealth out of what is effectively thin air. Subsequently, any nation using such a system must generate economic growth in real terms to offset this. If it does not, inflation is sure to ensue. This necessitates perpetual growth of a nation's economy. Otherwise, a crisis will strike. The natural ebb and flow of a country's economy is railroaded into a form of cult-like lockstep. This dictates many of a nation's policies. This colors the psychology of a nation. This eventually strangles a nation. Another point of great contention in modern states is the extent to which a government should be directly involved in vital sectors of a nation's economy. I will be brief, for as I said, I am no master economist. A method that might prove successful, at least in limited scope, is one that has a government participate in an industry without attempting to control it outright. A rough example of this is the parcel delivery service of the United States Postal Service. This is an organization that is in the business of parcel delivery as a government entity, but competes with private entities such as United Parcel Service and the company formerly known as Federal Express. This is perhaps a poor example, as the rise of electronic mail has, in the past, threatened the viability of some functions of the Postal Service. In addition to this, the United States Postal Service is legally mandated to provide a uniformity of quality and rate to all that it serves. This could prove cumbersome in certain instances if such a concept were to be extrapolated. Poor example or not, it manages to illustrate the basic idea. There are many times where a government seems to think it knows best how an industry should proceed in its business. If it is so, then let them prove it. Let them participate in an industry under the same regulations that they have imposed on private companies within a sector. If they are successful, then they can provide valuable competition and help set positive industry standards. If they fail, though, then their project can crumble without doing too much damage to the rest of the industry. A quick economic note on the concept of class conflict. While any of the three classes might participate in the buying or selling of goods and services, it is a generally true perception that the proletariat and the nobility tend to engage in the purchasing of goods and services. The bourgeoisie, however, are usually perceived as engaging in the selling or the organization of sales of goods and services. For this reason, it is better to have a consumer class, in the form of the nobility, on top in society for the purposes of consumer protection. While the proletariat and the nobility might not always purchase the same goods and services, it is almost always true that the nobility are far superior to the bourgeoisie when it comes to preventing people from being cheated. This is true no matter which of the three classes is being cheated. The bourgeoisie are often willing to let themselves get away with a great deal in this regard. Another supposed inference made by those who favor representative government is that they are responsible for the rapid pace of technological advance in the modern and early modern eras. This is not so. The progression of technology works much like a puzzle, or more concisely, like a series of jigsaw puzzles. The beginning is slow and difficult. The middle requires a great deal of thinking and testing, but the end goes quickly. As long as the pieces are not scattered or destroyed, then such a rate of achievement is to be expected after enough time examining a subject. While it may be so that some have vociferously opposed certain ideas and inventions, this is not necessarily a bad thing. The relatively short period of time during which a given scientific advancement goes from theoretical concept near the end of its development to actuality means that it is important to understand the full scope of its potential applications. Failure to do so could well result in disaster. The last major idea that I wish to touch upon is a purported combination of volunteer government and mandatory government. This is often referred to as constitutional monarchy, a thoroughly disgusting idea. These are not monarchies, they are republics in sheep's clothing. The families that presume to rule these nations have thrown down all true regalia, and not after the fashion of Constantine the 11th, but after the manner of the most cowardly filth. They are lower than the lowest dogs. They have acquiesced to the partisans of representative government for no reason other than to protect their own personal estates. That they can manage to look at anything other than the ground is testament enough of their shamelessness. The passage of time has only made these things clearer. Perhaps someone should inform these traitors that princes command armies. The so-called United Kingdom of Great Britain is one example of such a state. Realistically, true royal power has not existed in England since the quixotically named Glorious Revolution of 1688. Not since before William and Mary presumed to be enthroned has real royal authority been seen in England. A despicable farce, no doubt about it. For all the cogs in the propaganda machine of those who favor representative government, this is by far the most effective. What better way to discredit your enemy than to make them into an outright joke? What better way than to take their corpse and turn them into a marionette, so that by most methods of perception they are on your side? What better weapon for the corrupt? None. A few minor points before I proceed to the empirical section. First, in the course of denigrating the noble class, it is common practice to imply that they are thoroughly inbred. I would like to remind my dear members of the proletariat and bourgeoisie classes that on account of the close-knit nature of their communities prior to 1900, and the difficulty and expense of going abroad in that same period, that their lines are so utterly inbred that whole sections of the human population have been lost. They so love to seize on famous accounts that they forget that less famous accounts might be far more numerous. In short, those who live in glass houses probably shouldn't throw stones. Second, the partisans of representative government love to proclaim that they are not judgmental. They seem to believe that condemnation is the only form of judgment. To absolve a person or group of responsibility for any given act is also a judgment, though. Even a neutral opinion could be a judgment. It could also be a state prior to judgment, but it can be a judgment as well. There are a great many subjects in this world, and even the most brilliant could not be well educated on even 10% of them. It is a basic tenet of wisdom that one should be silent with respect to those subjects which one knows nothing about. I don't care how you feel about them. Do not condemn those things of which you are ignorant. Do not absolve those you know nothing about. Do not judge them, period. In addition, never those who let a chance at hypocrisy slip by. The partisans of representative government are, in actual fact, prone to gleefully condemning anyone with whom they disagree. Lastly, if what is said about monarchies is true, then it is a great wonder that mankind survived the eras of their dominance. It must be a great wonder that before the age of modern telecommunications and travel at speeds faster than a horse can attain, that the world was not plunged into such a state of chaos that no records would exist. To defend the points that I have made in this section, I will now move to the empirical section. That is all for now. Thank you very much for your time. Have a pleasant day.